There are betrayals that leave a mark you can point to, and there are betrayals that leave no mark at all, except that you're never quite the same person again. For Diane Whitcombe, the deepest wound of her life didn't come from a stranger. It didn't come from an accident, or a diagnosis, or a loss she couldn't have prevented. It came from the people who had prayed beside her for 15 years. On an ordinary Sunday morning, Diane sat in her car in the parking lot of the church she had loved since she was 31 years old. She watched families walk in through the doors she used to hold open. She watched children run past who she had once rocked to sleep in the nursery. And then she turned the key, and she drove away. She didn't go back the next week. Or the week after that. It would be well over a year before she set foot in a church again. If you've ever loved a church so much it became your family, and then felt that family turn its back on you without so much as a conversation, I think you're going to see yourself somewhere in this story. Stay with me, because where this ends is not where you think. 15 years earlier, Diane had just gone through a divorce she never saw coming. She moved to a small town outside of Columbus for a fresh start and a new job as a school administrator, knowing not one single soul. The first Sunday she visited Maple Street Fellowship, an older woman named Ruth took her by the hand before the service even started and said the 4 words Diane had been aching to hear for months. "You're not alone anymore." She wept in the parking lot that day, not from sadness, but from relief. Over the years that followed, Diane became the kind of member every church wishes it had 10 of. She led the women's prayer circle. She organized the meal train for every family going through chemo, every new baby, every funeral. She spent her Saturday mornings running the food pantry out of the fellowship hall. She never once asked for recognition, and for a long time, she never needed to, because she had something better. She had belonging. If you'd asked anyone at Maple Street to describe Diane, you'd have heard the same thing over and over. If you need someone to show up for you at 2 in the morning, it's Diane. So how does a woman like that end up sitting alone in a parking lot, unable to walk through the doors? That question doesn't have a simple answer. And the real story took root almost a full year before Diane ever knew anything was wrong. It never starts with a fight. It starts with small things you can talk yourself out of noticing. A friend who used to linger after Bible study now gathers her things quickly. A room that goes quiet when you walk in. A group photo online from an event nobody mentioned to you. Diane noticed all of it and dismissed all of it, the way most of us would. "You're imagining things," her closest friend at the church, a woman named Carol, told her one night. "Everyone loves you. You're probably just tired." Diane wanted so badly to believe that. She needed to. Because the alternative, that something was actually wrong, and no one would tell her what, was almost too painful to sit with. Weeks passed. Her phone, which used to buzz constantly with prayer requests and check-ins, went quiet. Text messages she sent went unanswered for days. And then one Sunday, a ministry leader named Mark pulled her aside before service with an expression she'd never seen him wear. "We think it's best if you step back from serving for a while," he said. Step back? Why? Did I do something? There have been concerns. Concerns about what? He wouldn't say. And that silence, that refusal to simply tell her what she was accused of, would become the loudest sound in Diane's life for the next 14 months. Nobody at that church knew where the rumor had started. Nobody could point to a single fact. But it had already done its damage, and Diane was the only person in the building who didn't know a rumor existed at all. The meeting happened on a Thursday evening in a small conference room Diane had decorated herself for a dozen holiday parties. She walked in hoping, finally, for answers. What she got instead was a room full of familiar faces who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "We appreciate everything you've done here," the pastor began. "Then tell me what I'm being accused of," Diane said. "Please. I've served this church for 15 years. I deserve at least that." No one answered directly. What she heard instead were phrases like, "protecting everyone involved," and "keeping the peace," words that sounded holy and meant nothing at all. She looked at Mark, a man she'd prayed beside at hospital bedsides more times than she could count, and asked him plainly, "Do you believe I did something wrong?" He looked at the table instead of at her. That silence answered the question no one would say out loud. Diane stood up, picked up her purse, and before she reached the door, she turned back one last time. "Families don't condemn each other without listening," she said. "I hope you remember that, because one day it might be your daughter sitting in this chair." No one followed her out. If you've ever sat in a room like that, waiting for someone to simply ask you your side, put a folded hands in the comments. You are far from the only one. The weeks that followed were, in some ways, harder than the meeting itself. Church went on without her. New volunteers filled her spot in the food pantry. Photos from fellowship events filled her feed, smiling faces, none of them asking where she'd gone. Not one elder called to check on her. Not one person from the prayer circle she'd led for a decade sent so much as a text. Diane's Bible, which she had opened every single morning for 15 years, began collecting dust on her nightstand. Not because she stopped believing in God, but because she could no longer separate his voice from the voices of the people who had hurt her. One night, months later, sitting alone with her forehead against the steering wheel in her own driveway, she asked the only question she had left. "God, were you in that room, too?" A storm knocked out her power on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday night. With no television, no phone charger, nothing to distract her, Diane sat in the dark with a battery lantern, and, almost without meaning to, her hand found the dusty Bible on the shelf. She opened it without looking for anything in particular. Her eyes landed on Psalm 27 verse 10. "Though my father and my mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." She read it 3 times. And for the first time in over a year, she cried tears that weren't only grief, they were relief. Because she realized, sitting there in the dark, that she had spent 15 months blaming God for what people had done to her. "I didn't lose you," she whispered. "I lost people. I confused the two." That night didn't erase the pain. It didn't answer every question. But it was the beginning of Diane finding her way back, not to Maple Street Fellowship, but to her own faith, standing on its own foundation for the first time in her adult life. Diane never went back to Maple Street as a member. Some chapters aren't meant to be reopened, only learned from. She found a smaller church a few miles away, one with no big production and no politics she could see, just people who chose honest conversation over quiet assumption. And there, she found what she'd been missing without realizing it, not a perfect church, but a settled peace that no longer depended on one. If you've ever been hurt by a church, you are not alone in that. But don't let the failure of people become the reason you walk away from the one who never failed you. He saw every tear you cried in a parking lot. He heard every prayer you thought went unanswered. And just as he patiently brought Diane home to her own faith, he is able to do the same for you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.